Hello everyone, my name is Kazuki Matsuo, and thank you for coming to my talk since there's lots of awesome presentations doing in parallel. So here I would like to give some talks about UEFI biosecurity. It's basically about putting a backdoor inside a small ROM chip on the PCIe devices and investigating what can they do. So before going to the talk, let me quickly introduce myself. I am a security researcher at FFRI Security, which is a security company in Japan. But last year, I was a master's student at Waseda University. And this research was done during my master's degree with my current company. My interests are mainly in UEFI security, but I'm also interested in trusted computing, Windows kernel, and most of the negative rings. Here are my contributors. Left are the security researchers in my company, and right is my professor at my university. I would like to express my gratitude here again. They gave me a lot of useful advices, even though their expertise are all in different areas. Okay, so let's get into the main topic. These 5 keywords are going to be important in this talk. First, BIOS is a system firmware that initializes the OS and boosts the machine. Initializes the hardware and boosts the OS. And UEFI is a standard for the BIOS. UEFI defines 7 boot phases from power on to shutdown, but you don't have to remember all these in my presentations. We only focus on this DEXE phase, where most of the devices are abstracted by DEXE modules or DEXE drivers. DEXE modules abstracts the access to the device by creating UEFI protocol. So, for example, there is a simple file system protocol for accessing disks. Most of the DEXE modules are unloaded before the OS boots up. However, some persist in memory during runtime, and those are called runtime DEXE drivers. Next is about what is OROM, aka option ROMs. OROM is a small memory chip on the PCIe devices, and it contains DEXE drivers that initializes this device. So if you plug this PCIe device and boost the machine, the BIOS will load the DEXE modules from this OROM and use it to initialize and use this device. OROMs are present both in external devices like these, and they are also in internal devices. Well, not all PCIe devices have OROMs, but they are mostly present in network cards, storage devices, graphic cards, and adapters. What's inside this OROM is actually different between legacy BIOS and UEFI, but in this talk, we'll only focus on UEFI. So keeping the previous background in mind, this research is about investigating what can the backdoors stored inside the OROMs do, what are the merits of putting it there, and how to defend against them. We investigated this by implementing 3 proof-of-concept OROM backdoors, and each will be described in more details later. So to begin with, I will explain the merits of putting a backdoor inside OROM. The first merit is that it is a stealthier place to put malware. And other than HDD or SSD, which is a common place to put malware, most UEFI malware places itself in SPI flash chip. Well, there are lots of tools to read SPI flash chip contents, and some EDRs are beginning to look this place too. So it is less detectable, but it is getting more detectable. However, there are no versatile ways to read OROM contents. There are no tools for that. So placing it here will make it even more stealthier. The second merit is that backdoors inside OROM can directly infect UEFI layer without touching Userland or Kernel. So most malwares or backdoors have to be installed from the Userland installer, so it has to be top-down infection. However, for OROM malwares, it is opposite, and it is bottom-up infection. So overall, backdoors inside OROM can be stealthier and more powerful. So now we understand the merits, but how can we insert backdoors inside OROM? One case is when device vendors put backdoors inside their own devices during the supply chain. We especially focus on this scenario because when you want to get a PC, if you can trust the PC manufacturers or the BIOS vendor, you can say that the SPI flash chip does not contain UEFI backdoors. However, PC manufacturers procures lots of devices from device vendors and assembles the PC. So you have to trust all those device vendors that they didn't include backdoors inside their OROMs to say that the OROM doesn't contain a backdoor. The second case is when a third-party attacker writes backdoors inside the device's OROM and sell the device through online marketplaces such as Amazon. And the rest of the cases are common scenarios. It can be installed from the user mode installer through multiple stages of infection, and it can be infected from the physical access, evil-made attacks. There are existing research that puts malware inside option ROMs. However, there are only a few, and none of them focuses only on OROMs. In any study, OROM is used for auxiliary purposes by UEFI malware for ensuring persistence or for a temporary buffer for lateral movement. Therefore, existing research has not focused on the infection routes specific to the OROM backdoors or the advantages of infecting UEFI layer directly without touching Userland. So taking these factors into account, this research is novel in the sense that we only focus on the OROM backdoors. While OROM backdoors can infect UEFI layer directly, depending on the tasks attackers want to achieve, it may be difficult to implement only in the UEFI layer. So depending on the functions you want the backdoors to have, there are 3 ways to infect up to which layer from UEFI. So if you only infect UEFI, you can do such things as reading and writing files and do some simple network communications. However, we cannot perform time-consuming tasks because it will make the boot time longer, which is suspicious. Therefore, you cannot also make persistent network connections. You can only communicate during boot. Now, if you infect up to the kernel, you can perform persistent network communications, but you cannot use complex functions such as shells. Finally, if you infect all the way up to the Userland, you can basically do anything, and all of the existing UEFI malwares are in this form. But the higher the layer you reach, the more you can do, but stealthiness is sacrificed. In this study, we implemented a proof of concept OROM backdoors for each of these 3 cases. Okay, so in the green slides, I will explain about the UEFI-only OROM backdoors, a backdoor implemented using only UEFI functions. I think the most important functions for a backdoor is to be able to communicate with an attacker. And this can be realized with HTTP protocol, for example. And as for what data to send, an example will be a file, which is confidential. And reading and writing files can be achieved by this simple file system protocol and file protocol. So we can see that UEFI protocol is the key for implementing UEFI-only backdoors. However, UEFI protocols cannot be used after the OS boots up. It is unloaded from memory. So for example, network communications using HTTP protocol cannot be achieved after the OS boots up. So UEFI-only backdoors can only do simple and fast tasks. Just to give you an image of what UEFI protocol is like, here is the definition and usage of HTTP protocol. UEFI protocol is actually a structure containing multiple functions. So for example, you can use this request functions to send the HTTP request, and you can use this configure functions to set an IP address. And one thing to note is that HTTP protocol is not enabled by default. So you have to modify some UEFI variables to enable it, like this. Also, when reading files using protocols, the protocols for NTFS may not be installed by default. So if not, you will also need to add DEXE modules for writing and reading NTFS inside the OROM image. Okay, so I'm going to show you the demo of UEFI-only backdoors. This laptop is the command and control server. And we can see that the file contents is sent to this command and control server during boot, before the OS starts. This is the log of the BIOS. And OS boots here. So lastly, I will introduce some use cases of UEFI-only backdoors. The first is the same as the demo, stealing files, but it can also steal application data. OROM can contain runtime DEXE drivers that can execute after the OS boots up, so it can search for the virtual memory and steal application data and send them via HTTP protocol on the next boot. The third is that it can not just only send data, but it can also receive data. So, for example, if the OROM backdoor is a ransomware, it can encrypt files during boot at the time specified by an attacker. So there's quite lots of things we can do with just the UEFI. So next, in the rest slides, I will talk about the second backdoors infecting up to the kernel layer. If you want persistent connections during runtime, you want to at least use the kernel. Of course, it is not impossible to do this only with UEFI, but you can find network cards from the PCIe tree and communicate using I/O without using UEFI protocol. However, doing so will make the implementations really hardware specific, and it is unpractical. Okay. As for communication methods at the kernel level, there are interfaces such as WSK and TDI, but both are ultimately I/O controls to the kernel driver called afd.sys. So before going to the command and control communications, here we will summarize the methods of how to execute code in the kernel layer. Installing a kernel driver is the simplest way, but it is also easy to be prevented by such security mechanisms like driver signature enforcement. And even if DSE is disabled, we can still detect it by enumerating driver objects. Using shellcode is a method often used by UEFI malwares. They hook the Windows initialization process, allocate the kernel buffer, and load the shellcode there and execute it. This method is more difficult to detect, but hooking the Windows initialization process requires multiple pattern matches, which is unstable. Therefore, we use the new method, which is to use kernel exports directly from the runtime DEXE driver. The advantages of this is that while ordinary kernel drivers can be recognized by well-known monitoring tools or debuggers, runtime DEXE modules cannot be recognized by such tools. In addition, when using kernel shellcode, it requires the kernel I/O manager to allocate a buffer for that. However, for runtime DEXE drivers, runs on a memory area where kernel is not managing, so it is less likely to be detected. However, there are advantages to this. Unlike kernel drivers, runtime DEXE drivers cannot be assigned driver objects. Therefore, some kernel exports that require driver objects or device objects cannot be used. Now we know how to use kernel functions from the DEXE modules. Next, I'll explain how to perform persistent command and control communications. Socket communications, including winsock, is actually an I/O control to the AFD.sys. So we can hook the major function of the AFD.sys to eavesdrop on communications, tamper with it, and add new communications. Specifically, in the proof of concept code, when receiving AFD receive I/O control code, it searches for magic bytes. And if found, it adds additional communications to the socket. This allows communications to be sent and received with the infected device even after the OS has started. So we now know that we can hook AFD.sys from runtime DEXE driver using kernel exports directly. But when can we hook this? This comes down to the question of how to trigger runtime DEXE driver after the OS boots up. Now, runtime services provided by UEFI is often called during runtime. So we can hook get variable UEFI runtime services to obtain periodic code execution. So we can hook AFD.sys in the get variable hook. There are two hooks. So here's the demo of UEFI plus kernel backdoor. Again, the laptop is the command and control server. This UEFI BKDR is the magic bytes, and if we send that request, we receive additional requests from the backdoor. Okay, so lastly, I want to show you the comparison between UEFI plus kernel backdoors and full kernel malware. Full kernel malware also does bad things only in the kernel layer without touching userland, and these came out a little about 15 years ago, but they're not popular at all recently. One reason why it's not popular recently is that the kernel security has improved with driver signatures, patch codes, and so on, making it very difficult to install kernel drivers. Okay. And another reason is that full kernel malware actually requires userland installer to install a kernel driver anyway, so it is not actually a full kernel malware. However, OROM backdoors does not require userland installer, and such security mechanisms like driver signature enforcement are not affected. Therefore, we can easily achieve what full kernel malware wanted to achieve with OROM backdoors. Okay, so in the blue stars, I will explain about the third backdoors that will infect all the way up to the userland. In this case, it is basically the same as existing UEFI malwares, but by taking advantages of the characteristics of runtime DEXE modules, we can make it even more difficult to detect. One big feature of a runtime DEXE driver is that it can execute both in boot phase and the runtime phase. So using this feature, attacker can move the suspicious process to the boot phase where antivirus or EDR cannot see. So for example, think about the case when you want to allocate a read-write executable buffer and placing a shellcode there. If you do this all in the userland, it is suspicious, but if you use the buffer that is allocated during boot where antivirus cannot see, it will make it less detectable. When executing code in userland, some process context must be used. So what process should we use? Many existing UEFI malwares often uses winlogon.exe or svchost.exe, but using a PPL will make it more difficult to detect. So as shown in this figure, winlogon.exe and svchost are not PPLs. So EDRs can obtain process handles like this and embed a detection code inside it. However, it cannot embed detection code into such processes such as this csrss.exe, which is signed by a higher PPL level than EDR. Okay. So in the proof of concept backdoors, we use the CSRSS, which is signed with WinTCP Lite. So I'll explain the actual flow of Userland shellcode execution starting from the boot phase. So first, before the OS starts, UEFI sets up a buffer like this. And then after the OS has started, runtime DEXT drivers builds the shellcode and write it to the buffer. Now, the runtime DEXT module is mapped to a high canonical address, just like the kernel driver, so these are shared between every processes. Next, since this memory area cannot be accessed from the userland, we have to modify page table of this PPL process to make this buffer accessible from userland. And the shellcode exists in every process's memory, but since the page table exists per process, the shellcode cannot be accessed from the userland in other processes, including EDR. So next, the runtime DEXT drivers calls the kernel export function called RTL create user threads to create a new thread in the PPL process and execute the shellcode. This cannot be detected by EDR process because the PPL level is not high enough. This is the overall flow of shellcode execution. So in the previous flow, I explained that we need to modify page table to make the buffer accessible from userland. So let me explain about this in more detail. This diagram shows the flow of how virtual address is converted to a physical address in the full level paging. Page tables are referred in the order of PML4, PDP, PD, and page table. And the base address of the PML4 table is stored in the CR3 register. The information of whether a page can be accessed from user mode or only from the kernel mode is managed by the user supervisor bit in each of these entries. So if you set this bit 1 for each of these entries that points to the physical address of the buffer where the shellcode is located, we can make the buffer accessible from userland. However, the problem here is that the address in the page tables and in the CR3 are all in physical addresses. The runtime DEXT modules runs on the virtual address after the OS starts, so even if you read CR3 register, you cannot access to the PML4 because it is in physical address. Also, there is a kernel export to convert physical address to the virtual address, but it doesn't seem to work with the UEFI-related address because kernel I/O manager doesn't manage this area. Therefore, to modify the page table, we need some ways to read and write physical addresses. A common method to do this is to use identity page table, where physical address is mapped to an exact same virtual address. However, the current instructions on the runtime DEXT driver is mapped to a virtual address, so if you change the whole page table with CR3, the current instruction will locate it to the different address and it will crash. So you cannot change CR3 register that easily. In this study, we devised and used a new method called partial identity mapping. So since the runtime DEXT module is mapped to a high canonical address, it doesn't actually use the first entry of the PML4 table, PML4 On the other hand, identity paging can be realized with just this first entry of the PML4. So by replacing this entry of the currently using page table, runtime DEXE modules can continue to operate on the virtual address and switches to the identity paging only when accessing the physical address. Okay, so now that the shellcode can be accessed from the userland, all that remains is to create a thread and run it. However, there is still one problem left. Control flow guard will prevent our execution. Well, this can be easily bypassed by patching the first few bytes of the NTDLL functions. However, making the page writable is prohibited by another security mechanism called arbitrary code guard, ACG. So for this problem, we can again utilize partial identity mapping, because whether a page is writable or not is also determined by the page table. So if we use a different page table that has write permissions, we can bypass CFC by patching without worrying about ACG. Okay, this is getting complicated, so I'll explain CFG bypass using partial identity mapping with this diagram. So to patch the functions in the NTDLL, so when you write to the virtual address of this function, the original page table is referenced. And since the read-write bit is set to 0 here, you will get an access violation. However, if you write to the physical address, the page table of the partial identity table is referenced because this is swapped. And since the read-write bit here is set to 1 here, because we made this page table, the writing will be success. So this allows you to bypass CFG with patching without worrying about ACG. Okay, so finally, userland shellcode execution should be successful without any problems. However, if we go even farther, there is still a possibility that it may be detected by ETW, event tracing for Windows. ETW logging function is implemented in each kernel export. So as long as you use the kernel exports, there's a possibility of getting detected by ETW. However, this can also easily be bypassed by patching the kernel exports ETW write and ETW ex to return immediately. Therefore, we again use partial identity mapping to bypass this, just like CFG. So here is the summary of the overall flow of UEFI plus kernel plus userland backdoors. First, the buffer and the identity page table is prepared during boot. The OS starts and enters the runtime phase. The execution is transferred to the runtime DEXE modules by hooking the runtime services, get variable service. Next, the process context is set to a csrss.exe, a PPL process. Next, the page table is modified to make the shellcode buffer accessible from userland, and the shellcode is written to the buffer. After patching CFG and ETW to bypass this, the shellcode is executed with RTL create user thread. When finished, the patched contents are restored. Okay, so here's the demo of the final UEFI plus kernel plus userland backdoors. Oh, in this demo, the laptop is nothing. It just shows the source code. Okay, so this userland message is sent from the OROM backdoors, and ETW consumer is not recognizing this event. Oh, and we use the custom ETW consumer to only get the events of the csrss.exe. Okay, so lastly, I'll explain about how can we defend against these backdoors. In the case of attacks from the third-party attackers, this can be easily prevented by enabling secure boot because they don't have the official secure boot certificate. In some BIOS like MSI's BIOS, secure boot setting is separated for OROMs and for BIOS. So please ensure to set secure boot for OROM as well. Conversely, there are some products where even the official OROM is not signed. And in order to use such products, we have to disable secure boot to use it. So device vendors should attach secure boot certificates to protect customers from getting the OROM backdoor devices, or else device vendors will be blamed for putting the backdoors. Also, there is secure boot bypass vulnerabilities have been found. Recently, there was PK fail announced by Binary. So these should be fixed to prevent third-party OROM backdoors as well. However, if the device vendor itself is the attacker or the backdoor is inserted during the supply chain, secure boot cannot prevent these kind of attacks. So we need a way to extract and investigate the contents of the OROM, but currently there are no tools to do that. But in either case, the network communication is essential for backdoors, so the detection from network communication is important when investigating this kind of backdoors. Okay, so this is the wrap-up. OROM is a highly stealthy place to put malware and can directly infect UEFI, which has high privilege. Its infection routes are more than just evil maid scenarios, and it is wide. We implemented 3 proof-of-concept backdoors based on the OROM specific feature and considered defense mechanisms against them. Here's some disclaimers. And the source code is public on this link, but it is stripped for security purposes. So please contact this email address for the full source code. Thank you for listening.